All right, here we go. Fantastic. So here we are. SEO for e-commerce. One of my favorite topics. First of all, thank you very much for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bastian. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Peak Ace, which is a full-service performance marketing agency based in Berlin. And amongst other things, we do a lot of technical SEO stuff, so to say. And for today, for the next 45 minutes, I kind of put together what I think are the most important things when it comes to, when you run an online shop, when you run an e-commerce platform, nationally, internationally, etc. And those things that, that oftentimes we see go wrong, don't work out, etc., etc. Before we get started, one quick remark. So of course, I'm trying to kind of follow the chat, so kind of feel free to kind of post your questions there. Either I kind of catch them when we go along, or of course we have some time at the end. And also, it's going to be a lot of slides. I think close to 100. So we're gonna go fast. If you want the slide deck, no problem at all. You can just email me or the team, hi@pa.ag, and you get the slides. Happy to share them afterwards, so you do not need to take that many notes. So let's go. Why a dedicated session only to online shopping, only to e-commerce? So let's kind of start with that and set the scene a bit. So I think from what we've seen in the past is like no two shops are really the same, right? There's differences in industries, and there's difference in sizes, and with size I mean, how many URLs do you have, how many products do you have, what does your competition look like, etc. So and of course, the same thing is true, if you're in e-commerce, you have potentially very much different challenges from a company that, for example, is working in publishing or in lead gen, right? And you could break that down even further, right? You could kind of say, well, the single retailer has different challenges as a multi-retailer. That's of course true, but you would still see a lot of commonalities if you look into e-commerce in general. But I mean, keep in mind, of course, if you have, let's say, a small shop that's selling, I don't know, 10, 20 products, that is obviously different to, a multi-retailer that has like 100,000 plus kind of products to deal with. Some of the challenges are different. But nevertheless, what I try to do is really put together kind of 10 tips with a strong focus on, what we usually call category pages, or product listing pages, and then product detail pages, the kind of the product pages themselves, because those are somewhat unique as well as specific to the context of e-commerce. So number one, the first topic I kind of wanna talk about and touch on is a bit broader topic, bit more complex topic, but it's somewhat relating around like indexing, indexing strategy for categories, for subcategories, paginated pages, etc. Because oftentimes what we see is when we do audits and when we kind of are being asked for recommendations, really, you would see that there's literally no crawling and or can be both as well, indexing strategy in place, right? So depending on the kind of the age and the scope and volume, there's really, you need to consider carefully what you want to serve to Google first and foremost, but secondarily, what you really want them to index, right? So like some of the common issues that you see is, for example, if you have category listing pages, product listing pages, excuse me, then you would have functionality to sort those listings, right? Or you have, for example, filters, and oftentimes, if not taken care of properly, what you would see is that those, for example, cause duplicate content, because you can kind of sort the listing, one way or the other, yet has not been taken care of, that those won't be indexed, or a filter oftentimes is just a reduction. So you have one listing that has 100 products, and then when you filter it down, you have maybe like 30 products, but essentially it's the same. It's just a filtered down list, and you don't want both of them to be indexed, for example. So yeah, there's a huge variety of things when you look at that. So filters, pages, product variety. We can talk about that in a second. But also other kind of more special pages. The shopping basket, of course, is something that shouldn't go into the index. Sometimes it's favorites, wish lists, etc. So just keep in mind that those are obviously special pages that don't really act as let's say entrance or entry pages from the search results, right? Funny enough, on a quick side note though, because sometimes it happens that there's different statements out there. Google actually released kind of their own guide to managing crawl budget. So if you have not seen that, it's a really worthy resource of trying to understand some of the complexity and also take some of Google's recommendations into consideration and try to see what they serve. So the link is in the deck, something that you can kind of have a look as well as use as reference. What I think is also important to mention here is that it's not a good idea to just serve everything to Google and let Google crawl kind of freely to a site, because especially for like large sites, what's going to happen is that they will certainly at some point spend time on URLs that are not really relevant, that you don't deem to be worthy. And this is a case that we kind of have done for a very large kind of international retailer. But what you can see is like when you cut down like the crawlable URL inventory, right? This led in this case really to kind of a significant shift, because Google all of a sudden started to crawl those that actually make sense, which is like the kind of blue bar, and the kind of the uncrawled, because we kind of just cut down like a lot of the fat, if you so will. Like there was a good shift to the stuff that actually really makes sense. So understanding what URLs your shop system is actually causing, and then kind of taking control of that, I think is a huge topic. Another one that happens oftentimes when you have a bit more complex category trees, really, and you're dealing with categories as well as subcategories, is that sometimes you see that. So this is kind of taken from Walmart, basically. They're selling fresh fruit amongst a lot of other things, obviously. But so they have, in this case, they had 4 different categories that somewhat are targeting the same keyword, which was fresh fruit in this case. So, I mean, that doesn't really make sense, right? So how would Google understand which one of those is really the one that you want to kind of end up ranking for that term, right? So you make it incredibly hard for Google to understand which page is the right one. So like, go through the category trees that you have, try to understand if you have really set up, page titles, or generally speaking, keyword targeting that's different enough from each other so that you don't create internal competition, because that's the last thing that you need. Google trying to figure out what's supposed to rank oftentimes goes into somewhat, unfortunately, a wrong direction, really. Then another example of what we see quite a lot is that, I mean, of course, I understand, you need some certain functionality to, for sorting and filtering, but, it can also be too much. And oftentimes, to be very honest with you, when we start out and audit those things, like a quick glimpse into the analytics system of your choice would reveal that most of those options are not being used at all. Of course, I mean, the default is being used quite frequently, but the rest oftentimes has very minimum kind of users that are actually kind of going and changing a default sorting or filter it down. So my kind of general recommendation, first and foremost, before you deal with that from an SEO perspective, is just really see what, are those filters and sortings being used. I mean, if not, you can get rid of them entirely, and only afterwards, with the remaining ones, you can kind of come up with a technical solution. So, either you block it for crawling, or you make sure that it at least doesn't create multiple URLs, right? So, it could be client-side solution with a JavaScript or something else. There's various ways to fix it, but be aware to try to figure out, what sorting, what filtering is there, how does it work from a technical perspective, and does it maybe cause a lot of URLs that are not really needed, or, again, competing against each other. Also, like on a quick side note, there's another function that sometimes you kind of encounter. It's articles or products per page. Honestly, like almost all cases, with I think 1 or 2 exceptions that I've kind of looked into the past, no one really changes the default listing. So like, the example would be 20 products, 50 products, 100 products. You should go another way and kind of say, like, you test out for you from a conversion rate perspective, which type of listing, and also from a web performance perspective, which type of listing page with how many products does work. And then you get rid of the functionality altogether, because honestly, no one is really using that. If you talk about pagination, we could spend a lot of time on pagination in itself. Also, how to kind of do that technically, and which way works best. I'd rather kind of talk about some other topics as well. And therefore, like, there's a really, really nice article. Again, it's linked in the deck here, where our friends from Audisto, which is a kind of a crawling tool, they kind of tested different types of pagination and how to implement them. And they kind of come to different recommendations depending on what you want to achieve, right? So go and have a read, map it to your needs, and then implement it according to how they describe how to kind of implement it. So it's really cool in a way to understand what's, because the reason why I can't give one single recommendation, to maybe kind of, mention that as well, is like, of course, for some companies, paginated pages are more important than others, right? For some, it's just like you have all the important products are linked from page 1, so you maybe don't even need a pagination, right? So again, have a read, see what they kind of recommend. I would say that's a great resource to start with. The issue with pagination, though, because that kind of got interesting from an SEO perspective as well, right, is that, there's this debate that a no index over time leads to a no follow, right? So that would actually mean that, if you have paginated pages, items, products that are only linked from a page 2, 3, 4, 5, and you put those category pages, the paginated category pages, on no index, that they basically would, not function in a way that they are supposed to be, because, what's going to happen is that page 2, if the links to the products are being treated as no follow, well, then the products won't be really linked, right? So I think what you also need to rethink is pagination in a way. Either, if you do not have that many pages that are pagination, you can of course set page 2 plus and following on index. That's the one way. However, on very large sites, that oftentimes is a problem, because it's just too many paginated pages that are essentially kind of useless. So the other way, of course, can be to kind of rethink your taxonomy in a way, and make sure that you internally link different from category pages to products, or you cross-link products in a different way, so that you're not relying on paginated pages, right? Again, no one fits all solution, but just simply saying paginated pages should be either set on index or no index, I think is a wrong approach. You need to understand what the goal of paginated pages is, and then you can come up with a respective strategy. Just following Google's advice, saying like, let us index everything on large scale sites, that certainly is going to cause havoc. I can guarantee you that much. Another classic quick side note on pagination, then we're done with that. Like oftentimes you see something like this. So this is a German company called Tausendkind. They sell kids stuff, but also bags and a whole bunch of other things. Their internal pagination, if you're on page 2, links back to the parameter p equals 1. But actually their first page also works without the parameter. So this is really a classic of internal duplication on, unfortunately, the most important paginated page. So really have a look on that and try to figure out how that's implemented on your site, because normally page 1 should just work without the paginated parameter being appended, and then you're fine. Another topic, quickly to mention that here as well, so we need to speed up things a bit, is content quality. Also in ecom, that actually is a topic. Thin pages, duplicate product pages, etc., right? Some of the most common causes of duplicate content are not necessarily only related to e-commerce, but they are still, let's say, some of the technical classics, if you so will. So non-dub versus dub, HTTP, HTTPS, and a kind of a hidden thing that people often overlook is get parameter order. So essentially, the URL would kind of surface the same content, but essentially the order of the get parameters is different. And for Google, unfortunately, still those are two different types of URLs, so they would treat it as duplicate. Also, case sensitivity is a huge topic in URLs. Trailing slashes, with and without, again, two different types of URLs. Overlap and taxonomy, I mentioned that already earlier. So if you have a huge overlap, then that's something that can also have a negative impact on quality. Another classic, I guess, for those that are in SEO a bit longer, you have seen that, I'm sure, at some point, indexed staging servers that are not being kind of blocked off properly. They kind of cause duplication towards your production environment. All those things you need to kind of be sure and kind of ensure that this actually does not happen, right? That was not specific to ecom, but what is very specific to ecom is oftentimes articles or products that are very similar. So this is taken from a German retailer where you can see that they kind of sell smartphone or mobile phone cases. And what you can see is that they have the same product 2,400 times, or 2,400 different URLs. The only difference is it's actually for a different smartphone and or in a different color. But no one is going to search for that smartphone case for that specific smartphone in a different color. Like, you could all bundle that together, and this is going to be an issue at scale at some point. So make sure that you kind of take care of variations, kind of very near product variants in a way, and don't index them all. Otherwise, that's going to be getting messy relatively soon. Also, inferior content, really. So what I mean with that is essentially kind of somewhat automatically generated URLs, right? So let's assume in ecom you have a product, and then you have ratings for a product, and there's some pieces of software, some different types of shops that actually they put those ratings not on the product detail page, but they have a separate URL where you have all the ratings for a certain product. And what of course also is going to happen is, if you have products, for example, new products that don't have ratings, they still would create that page. If that's not set properly to a no index, for example, that's going to create a ton of thin content and thin pages that you don't want. I mean, next to all the other classics, badly written content, grammar errors, same content, different domains, etc., etc. So really make sure that you have the indexing part of that solved as well. So I already mentioned kind of multiple versions of a product, so kind of want to make that a bit more precise. So an example here is from ASICS. So they have a running shoe. It's called the Gel Nimbus, and they of course have it in different colors, right? And also men's, women's, and they also have it in different sizes. But from a search demand perspective, really ASICS Gel Nimbus 2022 in black and gray and all the other colors plus the size, there's no search demand. People just search for the brand and the model, and that's about it. So I think one of the good solutions here could be just have one dedicated product page, and then kind of bundle those variants together. It doesn't mean that they can be linked through the hash in the URL, for example, but don't create hundreds of URLs for one single product, right? Canonical tags can be a solution. I'm not the biggest fan of canonical tags, to be very honest with you. Main reason is they would still need to be crawled. Oftentimes there's a bunch of implementation mistakes, so there's a checklist in the deck if you want to just to kind of double check your implementation. Of course, you can also and should have a look in Google Search Console and try to see if they actually would take the canonical directive if you're using it. More efficiently, I think, and also to minimize URL overhead, is the solution that Salmon did. So they have shoes. They're selling shoes as well. They essentially they just built one single page per product. They use the hash or the shebang either way to kind of still allow linking to different color versions, different size versions, etc. But it significantly minimizes overhead, not only from a URL creation perspective, but also from a crawling perspective. Somewhat the same here, and I know it's still early, but I thought a gin example, why not? I'm a big gin fan, actually. So the example here is the company has the gin, so the Monkey 47, in the category international gins and also most popular gins. But what they do is they kind of have the product pages sitting, so to speak, in the category URLs. So essentially they're duplicating their product detail page because it's part of two, or sometimes even more different categories. So they would be crawled individually, and of course they kind of it's not a good solution because they again internally compete, and both of them would never rank as good as if you would have only kind of consolidated that onto a single URL. another solution could be to kind of just put all the products into like a product directory. This is taken from German retailer Otto, where they kind of put all their product detail pages into /p, I suppose, for product. So you do not have this issue with, for example, multi-category trees. So regardless of the category, this is kind of the best solution in most cases, because you ensure that you only have every product kind of living once and not multiple times. You can, again, of course, use no index. You could use canonical tags, but from a crawling perspective, that's not great. So reduction goes over no index, goes over the canonical tag, so to speak. All right. Next one is around, brand filters and branded categories. So, to make it a bit more actionable, what you see oftentimes is you have, for example, here shown on the left-hand side, you have a category, watches, right? And you can filter this category by the brand. So you could say, I want, in the category watches, I say, I only want Breitling watches because I like the brand, right? But on the other hand, what you oftentimes have is, they call it differently from here to there, but like, it could be a brand showcase page or just a brand page or a brand category page, whatever you want to call it, right? But essentially that retailer is trying to rank for Breitling watches with a dedicated landing page, right? And sometimes they even add a bit more like, content around the brand on this brand landing page, but that's about it. Essentially, if you would not kind of take care of this, then you would have your filtered category listing competing against this kind of brand showcase page. So again, try to minimize internal competition as much as you can, right? There's no need for 2 or in the worst case, even more pages kind of to target something like Breitling watches, as in this case. Again, you make it unnecessarily hard. So you either, if you need the showcase page, then maybe you kind of can interlink them at least properly. So, or you have to block, I don't know, the categories filters from being crawled or even being accessible maybe in the first place. So yeah, this is a big topic. If you're dealing with those brand kind of showcase pages, then this is something you should definitely cross-check and see if you have any other internal pages that could essentially rank for the same term. Another very ecom specific topic, and this is actually a quite interesting one, I think, is out of stock, or expired or temporary out of stock product pages. So, and how to deal with that. So, kind of a negative way, or well, at least the way how I would not recommend doing it is some Marks and Spencers. But they have right now, if you kind of would trust their site search, you would see that they have like 200,000 plus pages of products in the index, in Google's index in this case, and they're just not, the products are not available, and they don't do anything, right? They just let them sit there. So of course, if you have a strong churn or like at least movement in your inventory, right? Stuff is going to be sold out. Maybe it comes back, maybe it doesn't come back. Those pages clearly will have a very, very different type of on-site metric or on-site behavior for people, right? Because they're like, yeah, I go there, I didn't find anything, I bounce back. At least the majority will. So, high bounce rate, low time on site, probably a small internal click-through rate, etc. Whatever metric you want to apply, right? So certainly, for 10 products, that doesn't really matter. But if you're coming to the tens or even hundreds of thousands, then that is certainly something that you need and want to deal with. So how to do that? Again, various ways, and also a bit depending on the product itself. In a way, is it only temporarily sold out or not? So will it ever come back, right? And secondarily, like what kind of related products or product variants do I still have in my store? So of course, I mean, the one way would be if that site is gone, you could put it to a no index just to kind of clean the index, and then have it back in at some point. Or if you don't want to no index it, then at least on site you could go and say, look, I'm going to use that for lead gen. So because if it's only out of stock temporarily, then you could say, look, I mean, do you want to get like an info when this thing comes back, right? You can, if the thing doesn't come back, there's not really much sense in preserving the URL, especially on like larger inventory pages. So basically, then one like kind of simple approach would be just redirect it. Let's say you have the same product but in a different color, you could put it there, right? Or if you have a successor product, out of, I don't know, iPhone 10, iPhone X, I don't know where we are. I'm not an iPhone guy, but you could forward that to redirect that, to the successor product, or at least a similar one. Let's say you have it in a different, in a different size, or the same product in a different variant, then put it there. If that all doesn't exist, well, then you can at least use your internal search. Get someone there, and then let the internal site search do the trick. If all things don't work, if you really feel like you don't need it, of course you can also kind of serve a 410 error, but only do that really when you never ever gonna be using that URL once again, because if you serve a 410, Google is gonna be quite quick and then say, look, this doesn't exist anymore, so I'm not gonna crawl anymore. I'm not gonna revisit it anymore at some point. So yeah, that's kind of the ultimate signal. Whatever you do, what I really like, or the other way, what I really dislike, is if you just do it without telling me. So from a user's perspective, like kind of a small info layer kind of a situation where you tell me, look, this product is not there anymore, but we forwarded you to something XYZ because of your interest, because of the relation of the product, whatever. Tell me that, and then I can still decide if you as a shop are relevant to me or not. Same applies, by the way, if you have categories with high product churn rate. So you need an exit strategy for paginated categories as well. So let's say you have 31 products, and you show 30 products per page. Then you would have 2 pages. One product is being sold out. All of a sudden, you have 30 pages. That means the pager is not going to be there anymore. So there's no page 2 anymore. But what's the status code of that page 2, right? So make sure that you have that on your radar. So maybe it's a temporary redirect to page 1, or it's page 2, but it sits on no index because products are coming back. Whatever you do, just don't do nothing, right? Just the 404, and then the 404 disappears again, and then the 404 comes back again, is not a very smart way to deal with paginated categories, to be very honest with you. All right, moving on. Number 7 is faceted navigation. So faceted navigation, basically, a quick example here. This is taken from Zalando. They, of course, faceted search basically would say it's a restriction of a selection according to different properties and characteristics and/or values. Sounds very, I don't know. I don't even know what the word is here. It sounds very complicated. I think essentially what you have is you have a product listing page. You can filter and trim that based on your preferences by various different properties, right? And if you would, if you and also Zalando would kind of allow for all of these options to become crawlable URLs, this would lead to millions and millions of users URLs that kind of go into the index, which of course is not what you want. So faceted navigation is a big topic. You can, for example, have a look at Boots. They do that quite nicely. Client-side JavaScript can be a solution. So from a user perspective, it's actually quite nice because the page reacts relatively quickly. You do not need to reload the full page. You just kind of push the products. So that's quite cool. A big topic, structured data. So we had the panel this morning more on entities and the knowledge graph, but structured data is also a topic, of course, in e-commerce, mainly for kind of the so-called rich snippets. So in this case here, you have an example like ratings, reviews, availability, or in stock, it's called on Schema, and then also it's aggregated ratings. So yes, this is something that you certainly kind of should be aware of because it gives you more real estate in the search results. Make sure that you test them properly with the testing tool that Google provides. At least it should be error-free. Otherwise, they won't be showing that in almost all cases. There's a bunch of different tools. I just kind of leave them here for you as a reference. Bing has one, Yandex has one as well, and there's some third-party tools that really help to either generate or visualize schema. What I like to do a lot, I used to a lot, is a structured data helper from Write. So essentially, this is kind of a browser extension which you don't need to leave the page. It kind of visualizes, all the kind of relations to each other. It also highlights syntax errors and missing properties and all of that stuff. So it's really cool because it's at your fingertips. You don't need to run any kind of separate analysis. It's free. So definitely recommend to use that. But also understand that there's oftentimes a lot of confusion here because basically, there's some things that look like schema markup, but they are not. So Google sometimes is just, extracting stuff from the kind of HTML markup, really. So they kind of take that because it looks like structured data, but it's not powered by schema. So if in doubt, you need to go to the destination page, have a look at the, your competitor's markup, for example, and see if it's really powered by schema or not. Then we have also discovery. So XML sitemaps. First and foremost, we should clarify that sitemaps are not required to rank. They are also not required so that the page is being crawled. However, it can certainly help on large sites with localization issues, etc. But if you want them and use them, you need to do that properly. And oftentimes what we see is like really poorly maintained XML sitemaps. So essentially, in sitemaps, you don't want any redirects, any URLs that are blocked, by robots or robots meta tags either way. No one's that point elsewhere with a different canonical tag, etc. So, use Screaming Frog, for example. They have a crawling mode called the list mode. You can download XML sitemaps, verify them, see what the response codes are, see if they're blocked, good to go. Or you can go one step further. This is taken from Deep Crawl, but most of the other tools allow that as well. You can verify, let's say you have pages that are not part of the sitemap, then you can understand that using what they call like the source gap, because at the end of the day, all important pages, if you use sitemaps, you want them in sitemaps, right? So this is also quite helpful for debugging and figuring out, if your sitemaps actually match with what you have on your website. A huge topic is web performance. Unfortunately, we do not really have much time to go into it, but I think from me, performance is pretty much and primarily about user experience. So it plays like a really important role in overall UX, but I think we all know that already. So Google said, well, look, page speed is a ranking factor. It has been a ranking factor for quite a while. Actually, it started for desktop in 2010, mobile a couple of years later. And now everyone's talking about Google's core web vitals. So essentially, the user experience, if you so will, is becoming a ranking factor. This, of course, has been pushed back a bit, but essentially we have like now 3 metrics, and those are 3 metrics that you need to kind of be aware of in the future time. Google is playing a lot with different things. Recently, just on Chrome, they introduced what's called fast page labeling. So like before you go to a site, if you just kind of press the link and don't kind of release it straight away, you get a label and they are telling you if that destination page is actually fast or not. So I suppose that we will be seeing a lot of different things happening on that front. This is just for you as a reference. Again, we can't go through all of that, but like if you're dealing with core web vitals, if you're dealing with web performance in any form, shape, or color, I try to kind of outline the 3 different metrics. What are they affected by, and how can you optimize for each of those single different metrics? Is that even a word? I hope. Anyhow, and that's also like a huge like checklist for client side and front end, but also server side stuff on my SlideShare account. It's linked here. So if you want to kind of poke around, have a look on web performance, this is something that you can go. It does really help. So this is again from a client we worked on. So kind of we slashed website loading times. It was a really poorly Lighthouse score of like 36. And we doubled it, which again, 70 is not great, but hey, that's something to start with. But it led to 25% more URLs being crawled by Googlebot. And that makes sense from that perspective, because essentially what you get is you get allocated time. So if you manage to serve single responses, or URLs in this case, being with them faster, of course, they can crawl more, right? So from a crawling perspective, yes, it does make a difference as well. However, I would strongly recommend to approach that basically from a UX perspective, or at least get the buy-in. Artists, yes, the slides will be available. I pushed them out on Twitter, and I have like a closing slide where you can just send an email afterwards if you want to kind of follow up with that. So we have, 5 more minutes? Yes, 5 more minutes. So I put together a couple of like, let's say quickies, just to see how much we can really squeeze into 40 minutes. So one of the questions that we kind of get asked a lot is, what if I need to delete or rename categories, right? So make sure that you don't forget 301s when you're changing URL structure. So at least like, let's say if the category name is automatically kind of connected to the URL or the URL slug, then of course, you have a new name or your new URL when you rename something. So of course, make sure that, when you delete a category, it needs to have it needs to have a redirect to at least a related category or successor category. It's a bit similar to the out of stock situation, really. If you want to test that at scale, one tool that I really like, HTTP status.io, it's for free. You can you batch test, upload entire lists, get the results relatively quickly, download it again, etc. So yeah, check it out, free tool. For larger sites, one thing that we see a lot is redirect chains. So redirect chains is basically one URL redirects to the other, but it doesn't exist either, but then it redirects to the next one. So redirect chains, I mean, most tools are doing this by now. You can also use Screaming Frog, Write, whatever. But have a look, do that frequently, like have a routine in place every other month or something, just to kind of clean it up, because it wastes crawl budget and it's also slow, right? Because if you go from one to the other to the other to the other, well, that obviously takes longer when you go directly from the source to the destination. Speaking of that, to kind of solve that as well, it is kind of mainly about hygiene, if you so will. So like internally linked redirects is something that you definitely don't want, because I think it's also not really a good quality signal. It's also true for internal link error pages, by the way. So you can should have the same routine really to clean those up. I don't think it's fine. Again, if you have a couple of them, okay, but if it's tens of thousands or 1.47 million like this one, I don't think that's a good idea. What if, it's another question we got asked quite a lot, what if I have no time to write my own titles or descriptions? Well, if you look at some of the negative examples out there, Google sometimes then does, well, not sometimes, they try to generate them for you, but oftentimes those results are really not great. So at least make sure that you have kind of a fallback in place that kind of makes them unique, because otherwise you would also run into duplicate content triggers. Another question, is what if I need to use URL parameters for tracking? So for tracking, whenever possible, don't use like real URL parameters, like with after the question mark, but rather use use the ones with a hash. For whatever reason, if you need to use URL parameters, don't forget implementing canonical tags. That's kind of a okay solution. Again, sometimes, or probably more times than not, they kind of not consider that. So yeah, I would not rely on that. I would rather try to not use URL-based tracking if I can prevent it, but if I have to, then at least canonicalize. Don't use it and never use them for internal linking. I think this is not really smart, because then you would lose link equity. They basically would just redirect, etc., etc. So never use them for internal linking, and also don't use some other random URL parameters for internal tracking. It really causes a whole bunch of problems. And this one I actually already mentioned. URL parameter order, if you deal with it, is also a massive issue if you don't unify them. These two are different URLs, and different URLs again means that Google will crawl them separately and potentially treat them as duplicates. And even if they figure it out on their own, you still have two URLs that kind of go into your crawl budget, which is something that you don't want, that you would like to prevent. There's of course URL parameter settings in Search Console. You can do that. You can use it. Keep in mind it's only for Google, which is maybe not the nicest thing in the world. So if you need to use it, then well, make sure that you find a solution that's appropriate for all the other platforms that you're using as well. Then another one, what if I don't want to kind of show all my content immediately, or I kind of need like this extended function kind of to show more content, maybe due to real estate. There's you can use what's called CSS annotations for content visibility. So like in this case, and this is the last thing that we're going to talk about, is basically you have some piece of content and then you press on a read more button. So whether it's visible or not, this content will be found. So we're just gonna test it and retested that a couple of times. So what you see here is basically the first piece of content that was on the top section basically will be found fine. And then the second thing from the part when you push the read more button, that will also be found, but this doesn't get the search result highlighting. So like if that's not straight away visible, then you might lose that. However, and so I retested it just like yesterday, funny enough, and that might have changed. So it's a bit early to say, but it looks like Google has kind of changed a bit of that behavior as to like they now show and you're not losing the highlighting. So essentially, when you do this, and you might kind of follow up on this afterwards with the slides, but when you do this, make sure that you use because there's 6-7 different ways of how to kind of hide content and then show content using CSS. Make sure you use the one that Google actually is understanding. So I have this in here. The test is here. And so that we do have some time for questions. There's one last thing that I have in my slides, but you can just follow up on this afterwards. What I'm going to do is I push this forward to the contact. So this is the email address. If you like, if you need the slides, want the slides to kind of follow up, then this is where you can go. hi@pa.ag. My team is kind of happy to send that over to you. And so I guess what we're going to do now is I just stop the screen share, and then we have a couple of minutes left for questions, if we have any. Or you're all shy and don't want to ask questions. I mean, that's also fine then, but I thought I'd just give this a chance at least, because I think there was a lot of content in here. No one? All right, so yeah, then if you would like to follow up, just drop us a line. Again, hi@pa.ag is where you can get the email, the slides, or you just find me on Twitter. That also works. I've seen already a couple of people tweeted, so that's fine. Yeah. Oh, now I see a couple of things coming. Okay, fair enough. Gary. Oh, by the way, good to see you, mate. Long time. So JavaScript SEO seems to be the biggest issues at the moment. That is very true. I mean, it depends on what you use JavaScript for, right? So is it the JavaScript that you want to get indexed, or is it JavaScript you don't want to get indexed, right? I think this is people treat it differently. I would agree. So I don't necessarily feel that it's an issue, to be very honest. It's just more complex from my perspective. So the major issue with JavaScript and getting it crawled, from my perspective, if you want it, then it feels like oftentimes JavaScript is not being fully crawled, or JavaScript heavy pages are not being fully crawled because the JavaScript is poorly implemented. So it's like it's super slow, and then Google kind of doesn't download it fully, or just like the JavaScript itself requests additional components, and those components are like further down the line, so that they would need to fully execute the JavaScript to get them. I agree on that front. If you have kind of more complex JavaScript that's not like a JavaScript framework in a way, then that's oftentimes that's oftentimes a hurdle. But most of the JavaScript stuff that I've seen is mainly due to poor implementation / kind of lack of performance from a JavaScript front, so to say. If that makes any sense. Artist, it's funny. This is exactly the part that I didn't get to. Repetitive content. There is at the end of the deck, there is an idea how to deal with it. I mean, of course, in the past, I think what a lot of people relied on. So what I see a lot is, for especially if you're in certain industries, and let's say they require legal information on the page, right? So that, I think, this is what you're referring to with repetitive content, right? So like, a boilerplate situation. I mean, in the past, we have been using JavaScript. That, I think, doesn't really work anymore, because Google kind of renders it if you don't block it, and if you block it, then the render is broken. So there is a CSS annotation that can really solve that headache. It's in the deck. Probably takes too long to go into here. That's why I kind of skipped it. But essentially, this can really work well. Or some people use images, but I think images is not really nice because they don't scale, like mobile versus desktop. So yeah, have a look into the deck. Shoot me an email afterwards if anything is unclear. But I think this is a really a nice way kind of to deal with that. So did we catch that? Yeah, rendering. Yeah, on the rendering, maybe as a final comment, we're kind of closing on the last minute. But what I see from a rendering perspective, Gary, like I agree. What's really weird sometimes is why they don't render the page properly. I also pushed out a couple of tweets in the past. I'm not sure if you've seen them, but like what I feel is like the cutoff times, and like how fast or slow something comes back to the Search Console versus what you really see in real life is a whole different story. I think one of the tweets that I kind of got back from Martin Split at some point was like, as long as you look into the testing tools and that it's properly rendered into the DOM, you shouldn't really worry about the kind of the preview, if that makes any sense, because I also kind of used to rely on the rendered preview a lot. But yeah, it seems it's a bit flaky these days. So yeah, maybe that's as a kind of a final comment. So there's this more info tab where you get the full debug from the dev console. I think that's maybe worth having a look if any other troubles come up. Yeah, and for the rest, thank you for the nice comments. Yeah, I know it was a lot, but I thought we used the time wisely. So again, drop me a line. Happy to kind of share it, and then feel free to reach out for any questions afterwards. And I think with that, I'm gonna say my goodbyes. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for popping in. I hope you enjoyed it.